And when it comes to determining what countries or what governments are socialist, you'll get a broad range of answers depending on who you ask and, quite frankly, what biases they have. Yet, for whatever reason, it seems that virtually all leftists agree that Cuba is socialist. And I'm not really sure what the reasoning behind this is. I mean, we all know about Cuban advances in healthcare and literacy programs, but what does your average leftist actually know about the specifics of the Cuban economy? I can't speak for all leftists, but when I really got thinking about it, I realized how little I actually knew about the specifics of the organization of the Cuban economy. And while online research got me some answers, I figured that the best people to ask were actual Cubans. So I booked a flight and talked to every worker, business owner, street vendor, and Cuban that would humor me. And this is, I think, the most accurate summary of the Cuban economic system I could compile. 72.3% of Cuba's workforce is employed in the public sector. So what are the average conditions under which a Cuban can be expected to work in the Cuban state sector? Well, first, wages in the Cuban state sector are notoriously low, with the average monthly wage in Cuba currently falling at about $42 a month, or about 1,000 pesos, with the minimum wage being $16 a month, or 400 pesos. This is, of course, factored against a system of social safety nets and low prices on subsidized goods. As for workplace democracy, it certainly exists in the Cuban public sector, with labor unions being run by their members and the country's government being controlled by the labor unions. You may scoff at that statement saying, no, the government is run by the Communist Party, and while that is true to an extent, half of the members of the National Assembly, Cuba's legislative branch, are members of labor, farmer, student, and women's organizations. In Cuba, the unions serve as a connection between the workers and the Communist Party. So that's how the public sector works, but what about the private sector, which composes the remaining quarter or so of the Cuban economy? It depends on where you are, but there are some consistent regulations on the private sector. First of all, private sector businesses are taxed based on the amount of employees they hire, and employees in the private sector are also taxed on their income. Employees in the private sector don't own the businesses, as you might expect, but the wage system used in some small businesses are rather surprising. For instance, the first worker I talked to was a woman at a private lunch counter. When I asked about wages, she said that for her, she was paid 10% of profits plus tips. Not necessarily socialist, but certainly not exactly wage labor. But of course, it wasn't like that everywhere. Most of the private sector, though, isn't actually working for someone else. 15% of all Cubans, or more than half of the Cubans working in the private sector, are self-employed, working for nobody and employing nobody. These are mainly your barbers, taxi drivers, etc. They own their own businesses and have regulations governing the manner through which they conduct business. For instance, you need to get a self-employment license from the government, and certain businesses have certain restrictions, such as limits on seating available in restaurants. One consequence of this, which I noticed while in Cuba, was that there was simply no place to just sit down in the more business-heavy districts. This is because the cafeteria classification of businesses isn't allowed to have any seating, but they also pay less in taxes than the restaurant classification. Of course, that's just one example. Each classification of business has their own restrictions. Even with taxes, which Cubans employed in the state sector don't have to pay, self-employed Cubans, or cuentapropistas as they're called, are generally still more well off than those working in the state sector. I would say that the main economic dichotomy in Cuban society is between those who can earn money through self-employment and those who can't. Finally, there are cooperatives, which are worker-owned enterprises. Salaries in cooperatives are often quite high, comparable to other non-state businesses. But just like the other non-state businesses mentioned, cooperatives are limited to certain industries such as agriculture. Overall, I would say that in terms of wages, the best are easily in self-employment, followed by cooperatives in the private sector, and in dead last, the state sector. As far as autonomy goes, cooperatives and self-employment are in the lead, followed by the state sector and the traditional private sector. Guajira para el recuerdo. Let's talk about the government of Cuba briefly. Azure Scapegoat has already made a video about how the government and politics of Cuba work. As such, if you want to learn more, I recommend you go and watch his video. Here, I'm mostly just going to expand on my specific experience with government and politics in Cuba. You see, when I visited, the government had just passed a referendum for a new constitution, the second constitution since the 1959 revolution, the first being the Constitution of 1976. The constitution was drafted by the Communist Party, with additions and changes suggested and some approved by citizens in hundreds and thousands of meetings throughout the country, showing the power of Cuban participatory democracy. The most notable change was the Constitution taking no stance on marriage equality, due to pressure from Catholics within the country to remove the article dealing with marriage equality entirely. This new constitution does, however, protect the rights of citizens through presumption of innocence and habeas corpus, puts term limits on many offices, creates new offices such as restoring the Prime Minister of Cuba, gives more power to local governments, and most importantly, recognizes both the right to private property and enshrines socialism as the state's guiding ideology. This has created a more free and democratic environment in the country, but it is yet to be seen how these things will affect the country's future. Finally, let's talk about Cuba's social safety net and all the things provided. Housing is recognized as a right in Cuba, and as such, Cuba has virtually no homelessness. The way they secure this right, however, is interesting. In the last century, Cuba would build Soviet-style public housing, but since the special period following the collapse of the Soviet Union, these programs have slowed down. According to our Airbnb host, who I figured would probably have a pretty good grasp on the housing situation in Cuba, the main way that the government of Cuba ensures that nobody is homeless is by preventing children from being evicted by their parents from their homes. This has resulted in many multi-generational houses. As an American or European, you may look at this and be surprised, but this isn't just something that is practical for the government. It's also a very culturally Latino thing. Speaking from experience, multi-generational houses are common amongst many Latinos in Latin America and even some Latinos living in the United States. Houses in the outskirts of Havana can range from $5,000 to $10,000. However, in the more well-off areas, such as the city center, homes can be upwards of $75,000. As for food, in Cuba, all citizens receive what they call La Libreta, or the rations booklet, a booklet that entitles each Cuban to a month's worth of food every month. This includes rice, beans, sugar, and potatoes. Although every Cuban is entitled to this in theory, many rural Cubans have difficulty getting their rations as the bodegas which provide them can be extremely far and may not even have enough to supply everyone in their area due to shortages. This has been made worse recently with the situation in Venezuela. Healthcare in Cuba is universal, and Cuba has more doctors per patient than any other country in the world, which is why it's not uncommon to see doctors being sent out of the country. The quality of healthcare received by Cubans, however, can often be subpar in rural areas, with medical equipment and facilities being old and worn down and shortages of medications. Education is free and compulsory for primary and secondary school students. For institutions of higher learning, education is free but not compulsory. Many students choose to go into medicine or engineering. Transportation is heavily subsidized in Cuba, and the public transportation is extremely cheap. To ride the public bus or the Wawa is only 1 peso, or about 4 cents American. The country's railroads are also nationalized. As such, a train across the country from Havana to Santiago de Cuba is only $13. Taking the Via Sul tourist bus costs around $49 for the same route. There are also collective taxis, which drive around a fixed route and can be purchased for about 50 cents. A ride in a taxi from Jose Marti International to City Center will cost around 25 bucks. There are also tons of other methods of transportation provided by self-employed entrepreneurs, but we're mostly concerned with the government's involvement in transportation. Side note, just for the sake of travel advice, just take the Wawa. If you're pretty intuitive with public transportation, the Wawa is your cheapest and best option for getting around. There is literally no reason to pay insane taxi rates when the Wawa can take you pretty much anywhere you need to go for pennies. Just be warned, the Wawa is constantly overcrowded, since most Cubans don't own private vehicles. Banking is completely controlled by the government. Speaking from experience, the banks have extremely long lines, but that's not uncommon in Latin America in general. Postage and telecommunications are completely managed by the government. Internet cards are sold at $1 per hour to gain access on your phone. Most Cubans I met in Havana had phones, but Wi-Fi was mostly in public places such as parks and not in their own homes. As such, lots of parks were crowded by habaneros sitting on their telephones. Many complain of the Wi-Fi being fidgety and slow, but I found that it was mostly reliable as long as you could find it. I hope that this video serves as a valuable resource to anyone wondering about the current Cuban economic and political situation. Still, take this all with a grain of salt, as the specifics are incredibly volatile, especially with Cuba being caught in the middle of the conflict between the United States and Venezuela. Hopefully, Cuba can further develop their system in a way which benefits all Cubans, even despite U.S. economic pressure.